The concept of warp speed shares just as much iconography as James T. Kirk, the Starship Enterprise, or Jean-Luc Picard's bald head. You cannot think of Star Trek without warp speed coming to mind. It's an idea that dates all the way back to the original series, and how Gene Roddenberry got around space travel taking hundreds of years. Instead, crews around the quadrant could zip around at light speed. Literally. With that being said, I wholeheartedly believe that this once advanced idea is already on the downward spiral to being obsolete in the Star Trek multiverse. Let's take the time now to discuss this idea, and what the future may hold for space travel in Star Trek, and why I think warp drive is dying out. Before we begin dismissing warp travel as obsolete, let's first spend some time getting to know what this concept is. For reference, we will be utilizing the Star Trek Online timeline, which is currently sitting at around the year 2450. So what exactly is warp speed? Well, let's travel back in time to find out. The year is 2063, and Dr. Zefram Cochrane has just launched his warp test ship, the Phoenix, with the hope of the world on his shoulders and 2 time-traveling Federation officers at his back. He activates his warp drive and successfully creates a warp bubble, traveling at a momentous warp 1. This event caught the attention of a nearby Vulcan survey ship. Upon learning of Earth's capabilities, the Vulcans helped usher in a new era of peace and prosperity for all humans. It wasn't long after this event that the world regrouped and pushed the boundaries of warp travel even more. In the year 2119, the Warp 5 complex was started by Cochrane and Henry Archer leading the charge. After Cochrane's presumed death, Henry Archer took the reins and released the first Warp 2 engine in 2142. It was only a few short years later, in 2149, that the Warp 5 engine was installed in a newly christened NX-01 Enterprise. This ship would continue to push the limits of warp travel and eventually exceed speeds of Warp 5.5. Development and improvement of warp drive continued, and by the late 2240s, Starfleet vessels of the Constitution class had standard cruising speeds of Warp 6 and emergency speeds of Warp 8. Eventually, in the 24th century, a new warp factor scale came into use, which placed Warp 10 as the theoretical maximum for all starships. Now that we understand a bit more about the history behind warp travel, let's get down into the science behind it and why there's already a limitation on the technology itself. The 24th century Federation warp engines were fueled by a reaction of matter and antimatter mediated through an assembly of dilithium crystals, which were non-reactive with antimatter when subjugated to high-frequency electromagnetic fields. This reaction produced a highly energetic plasma, called electroplasma or warp plasma, which was channeled by plasma conduits through the electroplasma system grid. The electroplasma was then funneled by plasma injectors into a series of warp field coils, usually located in remote warp nacelles. By using a matter-antimatter reactor to create plasma, and by sending this plasma through warp coils, the drive would create a warp bubble, which was used to move a craft into subspace, thus allowing it to exceed the speed of light. Because warp drives required precise measurements and constant attention, these devices would often malfunction, and in rare cases, even explode. Looking past the obvious safety hazards of keeping this reactor on your ship, it was identified in the year 2370 by Hurkarian scientists that the constant use of warp speed throughout the quadrant was having a negative impact on the subspace it drew power from. Because of this, too much residue from warp drive use would build up and create subspace rifts. These subspace rifts could destroy ships, planets, and even full-blown solar systems. Additionally, with the discovery of subspace corridors used by the Vaadwaur, Undine, Iconians, and Borg, it was apparent that warp speed was not the most efficient means of getting around the galaxy, and the concept of smarter not harder began to be passed around Starfleet Command. So let's review. Number 1. Warp drive was created over 400 years ago. Number 2. The reactor is an extremely volatile device and could result in accidental death. Number 3. The constant use of warp drive is causing irreparable damage to normal space. And number 4. There are faster, more efficient, and safer ways to get around the quadrant. These are the limitations that the warp drive is putting on itself, but let's take a look at the top contenders currently forcing the idea of warp technology into the Stone Age. Number 1 is transwarp drives. Number 2 is Iconian Gateways. And number 3 is quantum slipstream drives. Transwarp is an extremely fast form of propulsion, utilizing transwarp conduits that have a different property than standard space. These conduits exist in subspace and are often used by the Borg, Undine, and various other races. In 2369, Starfleet successfully created the X-Drive, which could create its own temporary conduits for faster-than-light travel. So let's look at the pros and cons of this technology. Pros: number 1, it doesn't require the same dangerous reactor as a warp drive does. 2, it utilizes subspace instead of damaging it. And 3, the conduits allowed ships to reach speeds well past the warp 10 threshold. Cons include: number 1, conduits are used by many species, including threats to the Federation. 2, the technology for transwarp drives is not fully understood at this point. And number 3, not all conduits have been mapped out and could lead to accidents or ships getting lost. Next, let's discuss the Iconian Gateways. An Iconian Gateway, or Stargate, is a nearly instantaneous transportation device invented by the ancient Iconians. By stepping through the door, or doorway, you could travel between two destinations thousands of light years away in a matter of seconds. To date, gateways vary in size, ranging from single-person transports to massive, ship-sized doorways. Let's talk about the pros and cons of the gateways. Pros include: number 1, doesn't require any type of reactor on your ship. Number 2, can be used for people, cargo, or ships. Number 3, almost zero travel time between your origin and your destination. The cons include: number 1, the gateways are completely alien technology and cannot be replicated at this time. Number 2, gateways often draw the attention of hostile aliens and conflict. Number 3, the gateways can be temperamental and accidentally explode, causing catastrophic damage to the surrounding solar system. And number 4, limited access because there aren't any gateways at or around every single planet in the quadrant. Finally, let's discuss quantum slipstream drives. The original Federation prototype was installed on the USS Voyager in 2371. Unfortunately, the drive malfunctioned and led the Voyager crew to being stranded in the Delta Quadrant. Since then, Starfleet engineers have reduced the risk and range of the slipstream drive, but the dangers still remain. However, this is still the fastest warp-capable drive in existence, clocking in speeds of warp 81,250. So what are the benefits and drawbacks of this technology? Pros include: number 1, its speed cannot be matched by any man- or alien-made engine. Number 2, it utilizes subspace conduits more efficiently than a transwarp drive. The cons include: number 1, cannot be mass-produced. The technology can be duplicated, but the process is extremely long and very dangerous. Number 2, the speed can leave your ship stranded thousands of light years from your destination. And number 3, the technology isn't perfect and will oftentimes break or accelerate for unknown reasons. So which one of these warp-driven competitors do I think will be the norm for the Star Trek multiverse? Well, Iconian technology is least dangerous. However, its limited availability means it would be impossible for most spacefaring cultures to use regularly. Slipstream drives are fast and work great when properly tuned, but their unpredictable nature would mean rescuing stranded ships every other hour and thus making it unviable for civilian ships. That leaves us with transwarp technology. While the more advanced science behind the technology is not widely understood, these drives seem to be the most natural evolution for space travel. With its ability to utilize or even create subspace corridors and clock in speeds well over warp 10, the transwarp drive is the clear winner here. Yes, a lot of the corridors are unexplored and could lead to lost ships, but that is no different than when Jonathan Archer first left Earth to explore the Alpha Quadrant. He didn't exactly know where he was going, but the exploration aspects of Starfleet kicked in. The same concept could and will be used again in subspace. The utilization of some of the other technologies mentioned in this video will still be utilized for various purposes, but I feel most, if not all, starships will be retrofitted with transwarp capabilities, and any new ships off the line will have never been touched by a warp drive. This concludes my video. I hope you all enjoyed listening to my opinions about why I think warp speed is slowly dying out in Star Trek, and why I think that transwarp technology will be the one that replaces it in the near future. I hope that you all enjoyed it. Please go ahead and share your opinions and what you think may be the future of warp space travel in Star Trek Multiverse, or if you agree with me or disagree with me. Please throw a like and a subscribe on YouTube, and follow me on Twitter at RealKetwalski. Live long and prosper, my Trekkies!